Today's daf is daf Vav. So after wishing you a Shavua Tov and welcome back, Bon Voyage. We're here with Kayotzibo Omar of Yossi. So we're talking about the Ole Bavel who came to Eretz Yisrael 70 years after the destruction of Bayis Rishon at the time of Tzidkiyahu HaMelech. And apparently there were a lot of Jews who spanned that period of time, meaning they saw the Bayis Rishon, and now they're seeing Bayis Sheni built by Ezra and Nehemiah. So we're going to quote now a pasuk in Ezra, Haboy me Hashevi b'nei Hagola. So right after the Romans, the Babylonians exiled the Jewish people at the time of the Nebuchadnezzar, the Bayis Rishon. Now they came back to Eretz Yisrael at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah for the building of the Bayis Sheni, and they brought karbanos. Now it's very interesting. These karbanos were brought as a kapara for the Avoda Zara that was worshipped by Nebuchadnezzar, the Jewish people, during Bayis Rishon. Hikrivu olos elokei Yisrael, parim shnei masar. So there were 12 parim, and in addition to that, the pasuk testifies, it's not here on the page, but we'll see it later in the Gemara, that they brought the 12 parim for the 12 tribes of Israel. And in addition, they had 96 rams and 77 sheep. And we'll see that's all Rosh, so we'll have to figure out why that was brought. Plus, the pasuk tells us that there were 12 seirim. So we have 12 parim and 12 seirim. Now, the sa'ir is a carbon chatas. A carbon chatas can only be brought for a shogeg, and the Jewish people, unfortunately, during Bayis Rishon, were guilty of avodah zarah b'mezid. So this whole selection of 12 seirim, male goats, for chatos, to atone for the sin of avodah zarah of Bayis Rishon is very, very problematic. Now, we know that a chatos is eaten, the basar is eaten by the Kohen, by Zichrei Kahuna. And yet, the pasuk says, at the very end of this pasuk, you'll see after the Vagomer, it says, Hakol Ola. Ola is kulo kalil, is completely burnt on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara asks, Hakol Ola salka daitach? Efshe shechatas Ola. How could it be that amongst the karbonos that they brought 12 seirim as chatos, and it had the din of an ola, and it was burnt completely on the mizbeach? And the answer is, Ella, what does it mean, hakol ola? Ma ola lo necheles, af chatos lo necheles. That there was a special din that applied exclusively to that set of 12 seirim that was seirei chatos, that you could not eat the basar. And the question is, why not? Tisanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, al avodas kol chavim evium, since they brought these chatos for the sin of avodah zarah that was worshipped by the Jewish people never at the time of Tzidkiyahu HaMelech, at the time of the Churban Bayis Rishon. Therefore, the Torah established that these chatos had the same status as an olah, and it could not be eaten. So now the Gemara is going to take this whole discussion and place it into the perspective of the controversy on Daf Hey Amud Beis in the previous Amud between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Meir. Bishleim Rabbi Yehuda, I can justify, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Mishkachas Leilahani Shnei Masar Chatos, these 12 Seirim, male goats that were brought as Chatos. And why 12? Because that's Rabbi Yehuda's unique shita. Kegon dechatu shnei masar shvatim maisu shnei masar seirim. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that each one of the shvatim has to bring his own carbon. And Memela, we have 12 karbanos that correspond to the 12 shvatim. Or there's another possibility here, inami dechatu shiva shvatim, even if the majority of the shvatim, but not all the shvatim, 7 out of 12, were guilty of sin. However, Rabbi Yehuda has a shita that we learned back on Daf Hey called greira. Greira means that once you establish a chiyuv of a carbon based on the majority, then even the minority are schlepped along. That's what the word greira means. And they too have to bring karbanos, is sha'ara inach b'greira. So through the principle of greira, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we understand why they brought 12 chatos for the 12 corresponding to the 12 shvatim. Ula Rav Shimon nami mishkachas lei. You could also justify the 12 karbanos seirei chatos according to Rav Shimon. Kegon dechatu achadasar shvatim. Now let's keep in mind that Rabbi Shimon has a unique shita that we learned about yesterday, and that is that not only does the tzibur, the community that violated an isur based on an erroneous decision of the bezdin, not only do they have to bring karbanos, but even the bezdin themselves, they have to bring one representative carbon. So now, according to Rav Shimon, we have a very easy way, a scenario of explaining the 12 chatos. Kigon, the chatu achadesrei, the maise achadesrei shotim, achadesar seirim, right, seirei chatos, ve'idach, and where's the number 12? That's the bezdin, because bezdin has to bring their own carbon. That's Rabbi Shimon's shita. And now we add that carbon to the 12, to the 11 of the 11 tribes that violated the Isur Avoda Zara, and we get 12. El Rabbi Meir, but now we're stuck with Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir does away with the entire entity of the tzibur bringing the carbon. In fact, according to Rabbi Meir, as we learned yesterday, the only carbon that's brought is brought by the bezdin. So therefore, the Gemara says, "The bezdin mevim v'lo tzibur shnei b'sahir mishkachas." How do we end up with 12 chatos according to Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir only has one carbon that's brought by the bezdin, and the tzibur doesn't bring any carbon. There's no carbon that's obligatory on the community. So the Gemara says, "Kigon dechatu v'hader chatu v'hader chatu atreisa zimni," that there were 12 consecutive occasions in which, as a result of the Avera was repeated 12 times. So for each act of idolatry, there's got to be a carbon that's brought by the bezdin. So the bezdin is going to bring 12 chatos. So now the Gemara has the following problem. From maisi lehu hanu dechatu. Okay, you want to say that during the Dar of Tzidkiyahu, there was a violation of Avodah Zarah. That's why the karbanos are being brought now at the time of Ezra. But the Gemara says, I don't get it. Maise. Now, again, sometimes the word maise in Aramaic means they brought, and sometimes it means they died. Milashon misa. And here it means they died. So those who had worshipped idols during the 70 early, turn the clock back 70 years to the time of Tzidkiyahu HaMelech and the Churban, they had already died, presumably. And how could it possibly be that Ezra would bring karbanos chatos for the avera of those who died? We don't bring a carbon for someone who died. Amar of Papa, Ki gmiri chatos shemesu ba'aleh b'misa hani mili b'yochid avalo b'tzibur if she'ein misa b'tzibur. So if Papa comes up with a breakthrough shita, and he says the following: while it's absolutely true that a korban chatos cannot be brought on behalf of Ruvain who sinned and then died. We can't bring a korban on behalf of a dead person, but that's only with regard to a korban yachid. But when the tzibur as a tzibur, a community as a community, kwak per community, has to bring a korban, then we have a principle of ein hatzibur mesim. There's no such thing as death of a tzibur. And therefore, we consider as if the tzibur is still alive as far as bringing the chatos are concerned. Again, there are profound meanings here that are way, way below, beneath the surface, deep down. But in any event, we could bring these chatos as an atonement for the tzibur, even if the tzibur is dead. But the Gemara is going to be very hard pressed to try to find a source for this radical new idea, a breakthrough idea of Rav Papa, that a tzibur never has death, and you could bring their korbanos for that tzibur, even though they're gone. Mina leid Rav Papa. The Gemara is going to try 3 different attempts until it finally settles on a possible source for Rav Papa. The first possibility is Ilem B'Michsiv. If perhaps we could derive it from a pasuk in Tehillim, it says Tachas avosecha yiu banecha, literally translated to replace your fathers with your sons. What does this all mean? So the fathers sinned, and now there's going to be brought an atonement by the descendants of the sinners on behalf of the sinners. And that could only be possible, argues Rav Papa, in a case where the tzibur was guilty of a sin. So here we have, in the case of the Dor of Tzidkiyahu, the tzibur was guilty of the sin of Avoda Zara, and now, says Rav Papa, even though they're completely gone, 70 years have passed, nevertheless, we can bring a korban as descendants of the original sinners because of the special status of a korban tzibur. Wait a second. If Rav Papa, you're basing it on this pasuk is not addressing a tzibur. This pasuk is talking about individual descendants of individual forefathers. And therefore, you should extend your principle of ein hatzibur mesim and apply it even to a yachid. And you could bring a korban to atone for the sin of an individual who's already gone. And by the way, just on the side, I heard more than once from my Rebbe that there is atonement for a dead person, and he had a number of rayas. That's why we say the nusach of vidui. Anachnu va'avosenu chatanu. We're reciting vidui on behalf of our forefathers because there is kapara for someone who's dead. And he used to quote the halacha of Yizkar, which originally, not the way we have it today, originally Yizkar was only recited on one day of the year, on Yom Kippur. And the idea of Yizkar is to bring a Kaparas Yom Kippurim and attach it to those who have already gone. And he had a third proof from a very obscure Rambam about Suda Maseches on Erev Yom Kippur, where you recite a vidui because you might die during the Suda. So the Rav asked, well, if you're going to die during the Suda, so you won't even experience Yom Kippur. And there, the Rav Soloveitchik used to say that the Yom Kippur is machaper even for the Mason. In any event, Ella diuka de Rav Papa misar de Rosh Chodesh. Imagine what they bring a sa'ir, which is a korban chatas, every Rosh Chodesh, and by the time they brought the sa'ir, people had died. The Omer Achmana Maisi Mitrumas Halishka, right? It's a korban tzibur that's purchased from the Trumas Halishka, where all the the shkolim were collected. So it's definitely korban Sa'ir Shel Rosh Chodesh is definitely a korban tzibur, and yet for Hamaisi Lahu mi Yisrael. Again, Maisi meaning they die. So it's very I mean, you have to ask an actuary this question, but it's very statistically probable that someone from the entire tzibur would have died. So those who still survived, how could they bring a Sa'ir on Rosh Chodesh as a Karban Chatos for the sin of someone who already died? We have to decide that that since this carbon of Rosh Chodesh is a Chatas HaTzibur on behalf of the entire community, it's not for Ruvain, Shimon, or Levi, but rather for the entire congregation. Therefore, the halacha is that kapara that's achieved through the carbon of the tzibur can apply even for the dead person. And that was, according to the Gemara's second presentation. First presentation was Tachas Avosecha, but now we have a second possible presentation for Rav Papa that Eina Tzibur Mason. Gemara rejects this one as well. Mi dami soil Rosh Chodesh dilma lo maisu tzibur. How do you know for sure that somebody died from the time that they declared Rosh Chodesh until the time they brought the soil? It could be they brought the soil lechatas immediately after they declared Rosh Chodesh. Aval hacha, but here, in the case of the karbanos that are being brought at the time of Ezra, on behalf, as a kapar, behalf of those who sinned, who were exiled from Eretz Yisrael 70 years earlier, at the time it's in Melech, Vadai Mesu, there's no question about it that during that 70-year period, some of the people who had been guilty of idol worship at the time of the Churban Abayis, certainly some of them died. Ella, Sagmaras has a third effort to justify Rapapa, time of the we have a pasuk at the end of the Torah, and it says over there, "Kaper li'amcha Yisrael asher padisa Hashem." It's unbelievable. We're going to bring a carbon on behalf of Yotzei Mitzrayim. Ru'uya kapar zusha techaper al Yotzei Mitzrayim. Midechsiv asher padisa. You have redeemed them. Whom have you redeemed? You've redeemed the Jewish people who were enslaved in Mitzrayim. By now, all of them are dead. And yet, we're going to bring, and again, this is the parsha, if you remember, we read it, I think, about 8 days ago, of Egla Rufa. And the Arifas Egla in the Nachal Eson is a kapara for the sin of, says the Torah, not only the sin of this person who killed the slain corpse that we found, but also for the sin of the Yotzei Mitzrayim. So we're going back to the door of Mitzrayim now, and it's very statistically probable, shall we say, that the Asher Padisa, the Yotzei Mitzrayim, are long gone, and yet we're bringing this kapara of Egla Rufa on behalf of those who are dead. And the same thing, therefore, says Rav Papa, should apply to any carbon tzibur. For example, when they came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and they brought these karbanos on behalf of the exiles of Bayis Rishon at the Churban of Bayis Rishon, and even though they were dead, Ezra could bring all these karbanos, and Einat Tzibur Meis. Kumar rejects this as well, or at least tries to reject it. Mi dami hasam kulu isnin. In the case of Egla Rufa, at least the kapara of Egla Rufa is meaningful for everybody who's still alive at the time that they found the dead body. So when they do the Arifas HaEgla, everyone's alive, and now we can apply a principle called Migu. Not the Migu of Dine Mamas, but Migu of extension. And the principle is Migu de Kapra Chaim b'Kapra Mesim. Since there's a meaningful kapara here for those who are alive, therefore we can already extend it, and the kapara is powerful and valid even for those who are dead. Al hacha. But here, in the case of the people who worshipped idolatry at the time of Tzidkiyahu and Churban Abayis, they're all gone. There's no one left. So you're bringing karbanos for the dead. Mi Avichaim, did anybody survive over that 70-year period? And now we're going to get an unbelievable thing. I don't know exactly how these miracles happen, but the Gemara says, Einach hinami. I'm going to prove to you from a pasuk in Sefer Ezra that I'm going to say it toned down, and then I'm going to have to tone it up, that there were some survivors from Churban Bayis Rishon for the exile at the time of the Bavliim, at the time of Ezra, when Ezra came back from Bavel. How do I know this? The Siv, the Pasuk says in Ezra, for Rabbi Me'akodim v'alavim b'roshei ha'avos. And what happens is there was an absolute outburst of crying. Who was crying? I mean, after all, this is a very happy occasion when the Bayis Sheni was built. But who was crying? Those who saw Bayis Rishon. And their cries were very loud. So there were two things going on here. There were cries of joy for those who did not see Bayis Rishon, and there were cries of sadness for those who witnessed and experienced Bayis Rishon. So the Gemara says, okay, there were a few survivors. Imagine, let's say, a fellow was 25 years old at the time of Churban Bayis Rishon, and he's now 95 years old. Baruch Hashem, Lepnach, he's still alive, and we're bringing a carbon on his behalf, and we're going to apply migu. So the Gemara says, maybe you need a tzibur, a community, in order to apply migu. You have to have a live community, like in the case of Eglah Rufa, we have a live community. And once we have a live community, we could apply migu, and the kapara could be relevant even to those who died. But in the case of Bayis Rishon, how many survived already? A handful of people who were above 90? Okay, fine. But I don't know if that's enough to justify a carbon to be mechaper for the idolatry of the Friedrich generation. And now the Gemara says something which is mind-boggling. The Gemara is going to say that amongst the people, the Jewish people who returned at the time of Aliyah Sheni, at the time of Bayis Sheni, when Ezra established the Mikdash, most of them were alive during Bayis Rishon. Could you imagine such a thing? Ksiv ve'ein ha'am makirim kol shuas hasimcha l'kol bechi ha'am v'kol nishmat l'mecha. The crying of those who had witnessed Bayis Rishon was so intense that you couldn't even hear the sounds of joy that came from those who did not witness. So it means, therefore, that the majority of the people who came at that time with Ezra to establish Bayis Sheni had experienced the Churban of Bayis Rishon. Now the Gemara raises another question. How can you bring a Korban Chatas for those who worshipped idols during the time of Bayis Rishon? For a Mezidim Havu, we don't have an entity of a Korban Chatas for a Mezid, for a deliberate violation. We only have for a Shogeg, when somebody inadvertently violates a Chiv Kares. And the Gemara answers, Horosh Shahavi, this entire entity of bringing chatos for sins of the previous generation that were violated b'mezid deliberately, that defies the very basic essence or structure of a korban chatos. But Horosh Shah, this was just Horosh Shah, only for that hour. And I'm going to prove to you that it's a Rasha. Hachinam mistabra teilo temach. You don't say it's a Rasha. Elim tishim v'shisha kvasim shiva v'shiva. How could it be that they brought 96 rams, 77 sheep? What is that all about? Keneged me. I mean, we spoke about 12. Keneged the 12 shvatim. We spoke about 1. Keneged the bezdin. But these mind-boggling numbers, where do they come from? Ella, you have to say, Horosh Shah. This was a special ruling for that time period. Hachinami here too, with regard to the chatos for those who sinned deliberately and violated idolatry. Horosh Shah. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa Meis Echad Min HaTzibur. If one member of the tzibur that had violated the Isur dies, Chayavim they still have to bring the carbon helem davar shel tzibur. However, echad mi bezdin ptur. If between the time of the erroneous decision or ruling, let's call it, of the bezdin and the time that they brought the parallel davar shel tzibur, one of the members of the Sanhedrin died, is pturim. They don't bring a carbon helem davar shel tzibur. Montana. Who could that be? So first the Gemara says, in the name of Rav, that it's got to be Rabbi Meir. The Omer Bezdin Mevim V'lo Tzibur. Remember, we had already a few times over and over again that according to Rabbi Meir, the obligation to bring Helim Davar Shel Tzibur is incumbent upon the Bezdin. But now, one member of the Bezdin is not there, and once we're missing one Bezdin, we don't have the entire Bezdin, then there's no carbon. The Omer Bezdin Mevim V'lo Tzibur. Hilkoch Meis Echad Min HaTzibur Chayavin. Therefore, if one of them dies, fine. That's it. Ta'kayim kule bezdin. Just 1 second, sorry. So, if one of the members of the congregation dies, chayavin. Why? Because all the members of Sanhedrin who have to bring the carbon are alive. But they'll come to the bezdin. But meis echad min bezdin. But if not the congregation died, that's not a problem. But if one of the members of the court dies, then kulam pturim, they're all patur. Well, okay. Okay, this is a very how should I say, a very profound concept. When we count entities, personalities, communities, and so forth, you and I would have said there are two categories. There's a yochid and there's a tzibur. The Gemara now is a breakthrough. There's a third category somewhere in between, as we'd say in Yiddish, nishtaher, nishtahid. And what is that category? That's called a shutfus, a carbon shutfit. Now, you may ask me, what is a carbon shutfit? Or more profoundly, what is shutfus? Is shutfus a partnership of individuals, and basically it's many individuals, that's all it is, or does shutfus create a new entity which is like a quasi-tzibur? It's not a tzibur because a tzibur is an entity beyond shutfim. Shutfim are still individuals. And now the Gemara is presenting the possibility that the chatos that were brought at the time of Ezra were not classified and defined as a chiyuv tzibur, but rather as a chiyuv of a partnership. And why is that? Because again, we're going according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir's sheet is that who has to bring the karbanos? It's the bezdin. So now we could say that the community, leave out the word community, sorry, that the court, the bezdin, bringing this carbon is bringing the carbon as an amalgamation of partners. And with regard to partners, if partnership is basically like a carbon yachid in a sense, although it's an overlap, but that element of yachid means that if he dies, then there's no carbon. So we need each and every one of the partners to be alive. Maskif la Rabbi Yosef, why are you telling me, Rav, that this price of the myriad karbanos chatas brought at the time of Ezra is to be attributed to Rabbi Meir Dilma? Nukma ki Rabbi Shimon, maybe it's Rabbi Shimon the Omer Bezdin im hatzibur. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's not enough for the Bezdin to bring the carbon. In a case of Helim Davar Shel Tzibur, you need also what? The Tzibur. Is therefore, now we can understand the Brisa Meis, Echad Min HaTzibur Chayavim. And now we have to introduce the principle that we mentioned before, the name of Papa, the Ein Tzibur Mesim. There's no such thing as death with regard to the Tzibur. However, Meis Echad Min HaBezdin, which is already not Tzibur, but it's a chiyuv on an amalgamation of individuals forming a partnership of the members of the court, is then Ptur. If one of them is died, then it's like a carbon yachid where mace bailov. Kinamrina de chata shutfim. And we're saying that if it's a chata shutfim and one of them died, then we can't bring the karma. So as far as the carbon that's brought by the tzibur, then we apply the principle of einat tzibur mesa. But as far as the carbon that's brought by the bezdin, according to Reb Shimon, as an amalgamation of individuals as a carbon shutfim, then even if one of them died, then if one of them died, then kula ptura. And therefore, the Gemara wants to object against Rav. Why did you, Rav, have to explain that this price goes according to Rabbi Meir? You could have explained that it goes according to Reb Shimon. Amalei Abaye says to Rav Yosef, Shamina and Leila, Rabbi Shimon, Diomar Chata Shutfim Eino Mesa. Rabbi Shimon elevates, upgrades the status of Shutfus to that of a Tzibur. As we said before, Shutfus is somewhere in that gray area, the twilight zone in between Yechidim and a congregation and a Tzibur. And according to Reb Shimon, fundamentally, once you create a Shutfus, it's above the ownership of each individual. It's a new entity. And by the way, I mean, this is not for us, but obviously there are parallels in modern law amongst the Goyim. You know, LTD, all these different things that are companies that are entities unto themselves. And that is halachic, you know, can I own stock, for example, in a company that sells basa b'chalav? You know what I mean? So you have to know what a company is. Is a company an amalgamation of individuals and I own my chelik, or no, it's a brand new entity? It has to do with many, many lawsuits, and this is 100 years of American law. But anything in halacha, according to Abai's interpretation of Reb Shimon, shutfim have the status of a new entity, like a tzibur, and therefore the principle of ein tzibur mesim applies even to shut Sanya. And we learned it with regard to the par that's brought on Yom Kippur by the Kohen Gadol. The Sor shel Yom Parshal, Sor shel Yom Kippurim. Now the Kohen Gadol brought the par on behalf of all the Kohanim. And how do we view a par that's brought on behalf of all the Kohanim? We're going to view it as a korban ashutfim. Now they lost the par. The par went flying. And they brought another par to replace the first par. And now they found the original par after they brought the substitute par. So they found the original. Is Yamusu Kulam Divi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that we could apply the principle of Chata Shemesu Baleho, which is one of the 5 categories of Aloch L'Moshe Sinai with regard to Chatos HaMesos. And what we're going to have to do is we have to see to it that this par dies. Again, I'm not getting into issues here, moral issues about, Tsar Bali Chaim and AS, all the organizations that represent the animals. I'm not getting into that. But the bottom line is this par has to die. Why? Because we're talking about a chatas yachid, because Rabbi Yehuda understands that shutfim is like an amalgamation of individuals. However, there are 2 Tanoim who reject Rabbi Yehuda, the dissenting view of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. They say, Yiru achi istav, that we can't kill, passively kill the animal. We have to let the animal become a balmum by, grazing out there till it swallows a nail. And once it got a puncture in its own, then we can do what we do with it, and we pod it, and we buy another carbon to replace it with the money that we get for the pigeon. In other words, the par of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, which is being brought as a kapara for Kohanim, is, according to Reb Shimon and also Reb Elazar, but we're interested now in Reb Shimon, a carbon tzibur, because shutfim is like a tzibur in this context, and einat tzibur mesim. Okay. So now let's just see, so we know as we move along, what is the final bottom line here of this brisa? The brisa establishes that if there's a carbon par helim dovashal tzibur that has to be brought according to Reb Shimon by the members of the court, then by the members of the court, then the brisa says that if one of the members of the court dies, then we don't bring the carbon. And just one second. And therefore, that brisa is against Reb Shimon. And again, just getting the cheshbon here. Therefore, Abai justifies the fact that Rav had to interpret that brisa according to Rabbi Meir, not according to Reb Shimon, because according to Reb Shimon, we would have to bring that carbon, despite the fact that one of the members of the court had died. There'll be a chiyuv karba because Rabbi Shimon holds that in a case of chatos ha-shutfim, we apply the principle of ein chatos tzibur mesiv. Amalei Rav Yosef, kohanim ka'abrit. You're talking about the par brought by the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur on behalf of the Kohanim, Shani Kohanim de Ikukal d'chsiv. I have a pasuk. He tells you to Vayikra Tezayin, Ala Kohanim al Kol Am HaKahol Yichaper. So we see a hekesh here between the Kohanim and Kol Ha'am, and that's going to teach me that the Kohanim are considered a Kahal. So if that be the case, then it could very well be that although Rabbi Shimon holds that Karban Ashutfim is not like a Karban Tzibur, and therefore once again we could reconcile the brisa with Rabbi Shimon against Abaye. You'll ask me, but what about the power of Kohen Gadol? That's brought on behalf of the Kohanim. The Kohanim have a dinner at Tzibur. And that's why the halacha would be, according to Reb Shimon, that ein achatas tzibur mesa, meaning if what? If what happened over here, just one second. Just one second. Rabbi Shimon. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, where they designated a par of the Kohen Gadol on behalf of the Kohanim on Yom Kippur, and then the par got lost. They brought another par to replace that par, and then they found the original par. And Rabbi Shimon was the one who said that Yirad She's Tov, and you can't let them die because Ein Chatas Tzibur Mesa. Says Rav Yosef to Abai, you have no right to draw any conclusions about the status of a Karban Shutfim, like the case of Bezdin, according to Rav Shimon, who has to bring a Karban Helim Dovashal Tzibur, from the fact that Rabbi Shimon is committed to say Ein Achat Tzibur Mesa in the case of Par Shel Kohen Gadol B'Yom HaKippurim, because Par Shel Kohen Gadol B'Yom HaKippurim is considered a Chatas HaTzibur. And why is it considered a Chatas HaTzibur? Because the Kohanim are classified by the Torah as a Tzibur.